Okay.
Okay,
All right. I'm on.
go ahead and speak.
Good afternoon. We want to welcome all of you to this wonderful talk about Chaco Canyon. I know several of you have been waiting a year almost for this to happen. So I'm so glad we are finally able to do it. Have my husband make this presentation. I would like to thank different people who have helped us make this possible. Janet Phillips, our wonderful librarian, and our board, who are Judy Schofield, Debbie Peterson, who is the secretary of the Friends of the Library, Dee Plana, who is our treasurer, Margarita Riley, Luann Webster, who are members at large, Marcia Spenceley, and Laura Finch, who are our co-vice presidents. We have everyone is supposed to be muted. At the end, we will do a question and answer time. So hold your questions and write them down, or you can put them in the chat room. I will have to ask Janet if she will monitor that because we're not able to get my computer to come up. I had hoped I could have monitored. I want to go ahead and introduce my husband, Dr. Tom Swetnam, who is a Regents Professor Emeritus from the University of Arizona, where he worked for 35 years and did work in various parts of the world and also in Chaco Canyon. So without further ado, here is Tom.
Hello, everybody. Let me switch back here to the
Oh,
first
see, it is being
slide.
recorded.
Okay, thank you very much for uh, coming today virtually to this talk. And this is a fun talk for me to give because it's one of the places I love most in the world. And I'm sure many of you have visited Chaco Canyon yourself and wondered at this awesome place that's right here in our landscape next door to the Jemez Mountains. And you know that it's just a world famous place. It's probably considered one of the foremost and most important archaeological sites in North America. And I just saw a quote from a British archaeologist, a famous British archaeologist, and he said that he thought that Chaco Canyon was as famous and well known as such places, famous places as Stonehenge and Machu Picchu in Peru. And the reasons are is that it's just a phenomenal place, an incredible architecture, and all sorts of mysteries. And one of the mysteries is what we're going to talk about today, and that is the lonesome pine tree that was found in the West Plaza, which you're looking at right at the center of the screen there, the West Plaza of Pueblo Bonito. But along the way, I'm going to tell you a bit about tree rings, the science of dendrochronology, the use of tree rings to study past history, archaeological history, and climate history, and all sorts of things. So I'm going to tell you the history about dendrochronology and how this remarkable tree that was found in Pueblo Bonito played a role in early dendrochronology development of the field of dendrochronology. Well, first, here's a few photographs. Here's a picture of when they were excavating, when archaeologists were excavating Pueblo Bonito in the early 1900s, about 1910 to 1930. They found a lot of wood. A lot of wood. The old roof timbers were still in place in the buried rooms, and there were also some intact roofs that you can see today. And you can see if you go visit Chaco, I'm sure you've seen the many timbers still sticking out of the walls. There's roof timbers, lintels that are over windows and doorways. There's just wood all over the place. Um, Huge amount of wood. The main timbers that held up the roof are, of course, vigas, which we know really well in our adobe houses today, 8 to 10 or even 12 inches in diameter. And then also there are these smaller diameter latillas, which you can see here. Keep in mind what you're looking at here is an intact roof that's been sitting there for more than 1,000 years. That's 1,000-year-old timbers that you're looking at inside of one of the rooms at Pueblo Bonito. And there are just thousands of these timbers. Um, and all of the excavations and inventorying of the rooms and the timbers that are intact, it's estimated that at least 240,000 trees had to be harvested. 240,000 trees had to be harvested to put the roofs and the window and doorway lintels in Pueblo Bonito and the other great houses of Chaco Canyon. Huge amount of wood. And so this raises the question, and it was a primary question that the archaeologists asked when they were first excavating: where the heck did all that wood come from? You know, you're in a desert landscape, you're down at low elevation, and it's just mainly scrub desert landscape with a few scattered juniper trees around nearby. And so the question is, a mystery was evident from the beginning, is where did all that wood come from? Wandering around Chaco Canyon looking for ponderosa pine trees, the archaeologists back in the early days when they were excavating, they found a few scraggly old ponderosas, like this one on the left. This is a 1920s photo from the archaeologist. It's an old, stunted ponderosa pine growing up on top of the mesa above Pueblo Bonito. And over on the right, there's a log laying on the ground there next to where that person is sitting. They found a few old logs of old remnant trees that were growing inside Chaco Canyon itself in the alcoves, in the little north-facing alcoves. They could find a few scattered ponderosa pines. But in all, nowhere near enough. They'd have to have a forest to supply 240,000 or more timber. So it's really clear from the outset there's not enough trees growing around Chaco Canyon today to supply the amount of timbers that would have been necessary to roof these amazingly big structures. Though there's a lot of photographs of Pueblo Bonito and the other great houses going way back. This is one of the earliest excavations in 1896, the Hyde expedition. And so you get a view here of Pueblo Bonito before it was excavated. And you see these really big standing walls on the north side, with, notice all the holes punched in them at the bottom there, where pot hunters were trying to get into the lower floors there to find whatever goods they could. But it's amazing. Think about these walls. We know now from tree ring dating, which I'm going to tell you about, that these houses were built more than 1,000 years ago, and there's 1,000-year-old standing wall there with timbers in it. Do you think your house, the house you live in today, will still have standing walls 1,000 years from now? It's actually quite a credit to the amazing masonry and stonework and architectural work that the Chacoans had to build this immense structure that is still there in part. Now, this is the excavated Pueblo Bonito now, as it looks more or less today. And there's just a tremendous amount of work, decades of archaeological work, of digging and excavating and recording and trying to reconstruct the history of Pueblo Bonito. So on the right side of this screen, you can see a map of the rooms and all the kivas. The round circular structures are the kivas, the ceremonial chambers, well known in pueblos today in the Southwest as well. But there's a huge number of kiva structures in Pueblo Bonito, way more than the ordinary Pueblo dwelling, which is one of the reasons why Pueblo Bonito is thought to be primarily a ceremonial center. And there's lots of debate and discussion about that. But while they were excavating over the many decades, they found lots of timbers. And so with the tree ring dating methods, that's what I'm going to tell you about, they were able to determine the sequence of construction of the rooms. So you'll see, for example, the red colored rooms. That's the oldest part of Pueblo Bonito, probably built back in the 800s AD, 800s AD. And then the later structures here in the green are much later, probably in the 1000s to early 1100s AD. Well, they found many interesting things in the Pueblo, of course, Pueblo Bonito, and many new findings even today. Things like scarlet macaws, parrots brought up from Mexico, and copper bells, and dozens of circular cylindrical jars, special cylindrical jars. And on the inside of some of these jars, they recently discovered cacao beans or chocolate. So clearly there was long distance trading going on down with Mexico to bring up chocolate and scarlet macaws. Well, the story today I'm talking about especially is this amazing finding in 1924. On the left side of your screen, you see this old piece of wood. And what you're looking at there is a stump. It's a stump of a tree. And you see the shovels and the pick here for some perspective, but this stump is laying down, it's broken off. And so down toward the bottom of the screen here would be where the log, and they also found a 20-foot long log associated with this stump laying on this last used surface of the west courtyard. So they found this tree right about here in the west courtyard of Pueblo Bonito. And they noticed these interesting, strange features. There's actually what looks like roots, big primary roots going off in this direction. All right. So this was what called the rooted stump. And so this 1924, they discovered this thing. And many years later, finally, Neil Judd was the archaeologist who was leading the excavations at that time, supported by National Geographic Society. He wrote up, this is one of the main monographs that he wrote up about their studies of Pueblo Bonito, and he describing Pueblo Bonito in great detail. And then at this point, and published finally in 1954, he has this statement and this interpretation about the tree. Its decayed trunk lay on the last utilized pavement, and its great snag-like roots preclude the possibility of its ever having been moved. So by the 1950s, Neil Judd and many others had come to interpret that this rooted stump actually had grown there, and that it was a live tree at one time during the occupation of Pueblo Bonito. This is in the 1950s. So as you'll see, this is actually a changing interpretation from the original impressions that Judd had. Well, there's the artist's rendition of the plaza tree of Pueblo Bonito. And it's just truly iconic. This, I'm sure you've probably seen this this drawing before. It's really commonly used by the National Park Service. In fact, until I think recently, and maybe still, the National Park Service's brochure that you pick up at Chaco Canyon when you visit Pueblo Bonito has this image right on the front of the brochure. And so the rooted tree, has been called various things: the lonesome pine, the rooted tree, the tree of life, the world tree. It's really been a fascination to many people, and there's lots of different articles about it and people speculating about what the heck this thing was and what its significance was. It captures the imagination, the idea of this amazing 2,000 plus room townhouse structure, 4 or 5 stories tall, with all these amazing ceremonial features in it, had a pine tree growing in the plaza. What the heck was that all about? And so it has captured the imagination, and it's been included in illustrations of Pueblo Bonito for decades, especially since that 1954 publication. Here's a 1964 drawing from another of Neil Judd's articles. And then here's see if I can get this to work. This is a YouTube video, and I'm not sure it's going to work. Yeah, okay, here, let's see if it actually works, if the connection is fast enough and doesn't interrupt my transmission to you. So this is a video by this Dennis Holloway, is an architect who draws he draws renditions of ancient Pueblo structures and then renders them in 3D so that you can see the vision of it. But as we're rotating around, notice the pine. There's the pine tree with showing it being a living tree, and notice the shadow. It casts shadows, and that's another one of the speculations about what maybe this thing was about. It was maybe something about casting shadows on different parts of the Pueblo. So again, it's just captured people's imagination over the decades. And here's another perspective of the stump itself. And I just wanted to put this in there because Suzanne is standing right there. I did a little repeat photography effort to try to see where this thing was in the West Plaza when we were at Pueblo Bonito. And so what you can see in the old photograph here is what I think is a low wall that I'm pointing off to in the distance there. And then up here you see a mesa top, and I think that mesa top is this one over here. And this low wall is either this low wall or it's that low wall over there. In any case, somewhere around here is where the old tree was. Well, when Neil Judd and the archaeologists pulled this curious specimen out of the ground, they initially thought, well, let's see if Andrew Douglas, A.E. Douglas, can do anything with this. And at that time, A.E. Douglas was starting to develop the science of dendrochronology, tree ring sciences. And so Douglas was using tree rings, and he had found out that he could use the patterns of wide and narrow rings, the fat rings and the thin rings, to match the patterns of unknown dead trees with a living tree chronology, and thereby determine the date. So they sent it to Douglas. They sent a sample to Douglas, and I'm going to tell you more about Douglas's method and also more history of dating and the tree ring laboratory. In particular, the tree ring laboratory, which is in Tucson, where I spent my career, 35 years, was established by Douglas. And that previous photograph was of Douglas here in the old West Stadium building. So this is the West Stadium football building on the U of A campus in Tucson. And this photo is right in the 1950s, just as they were building this giant concrete superstructure that sits over the top of the old football building. So this is the West Stadium as it looks like today. And I'm showing you this, I'm telling you this because this is where I spent my career. The last 35 years, I arrived, Suzanne and I arrived in Tucson in 1980, and I did my PhD there. And then I was hired on as a faculty, and I eventually became the director of the tree ring laboratory in the last 15 years from 2000 to 2015. Well, so back to the old tree, the old stump from the Lonesome Pine. They sent it to Douglas. He studied it. He actually did finally get some tree ring dates on it. And he put it into a box, and it sat in our archive. So here's a picture of the old archive with the boxes of the samples from all the many dozens and dozens of archaeological sites all around the Southwest and now around the world that are stored at the tree ring laboratory. And there's Dr. Bannister, who was the former director of the tree ring laboratory, who was my boss and my good friend, standing there at the old archive. Well, uh, finally in 2011, we received a $9 million gift from a very generous donor, a good friend of the tree ring lab, Agnes Howry, and we secured another $3 million, and we moved out of the old football stadium here, and we built a brand new tree ring laboratory. So this is the new tree ring laboratory in Tucson, just been occupied since about 2012 or so. And all the laboratories are in this, behind this, all this aluminum, fancy aluminum structure. And then on the ground floor, there's an exhibit hall. And you'll notice this brick building underneath it. That is the current archive. That's the current tree ring archive, where the rooted stump, the specimen known as JPB 99. That's the specimen number. JPB 99 is stored, and where we have now studied it in more detail. So, by the way, if you're ever in Tucson and you want to visit the tree ring lab after COVID, I'm sure you'll be able to go in. It's actually, this ground floor is open to the public, and they do guided tours for the public through the building, and you can see a lot of really cool things. Some samples from the oldest trees in the world, and this is a 12-foot diameter giant sequoia section that Douglas obtained in the 1930s, and many other very interesting things. But the archive itself is quite remarkable, and it's one of the great legacy features of tree rings. It's now collections from wood from all over the world, and the oldest trees in the world, and the samples have been used for studying climate history and fire history and human history and forest history, geological history, just you name it, all sorts of things. We're not even sure how many, I mean, I'm not even sure how many samples we have, probably more than 2 million specimens. Now they're all in state of the art, these collapsible shelving. You can move the handles on these shelves and move them with one hand. Over here on the right side, these are actually timbers from Chaco Canyon. So we have 1,000-year-old timbers, and actually more than, I think probably close to 2,000 samples from Chaco Canyon itself. Well, back to the Lonesome Pine. JPB 99 was again the number, the collection number for that particular tree. About 7 or 8 years ago, a graduate student working with me, Chris Gitterman, was looking for a project, and we decided to take another look at the Lonesome Pine and to see if we had it in our archive, which we did. And they pulled the box out, and there was JPB 99. There's the stump section from JPB 99 and Douglas's original samples. And here's actually giving credit. Chris Gitterman is the guy on the left here. He's now Dr. Gitterman, and he's still studying, working here in the Jemez Mountains too on some projects at the tree ring laboratory. And he led almost all of the research that I'm talking about today. And then here on the right is Chris Basin, one of my longtime colleagues. Worked with him for more than 35 years, and he and I go back to the Gila wilderness where we were firefighters about 40 years ago. And then over here on the right is Jeff Dean, who's one of the best known, most famous Southwestern archaeologists living today. And he's at the tree ring laboratory. He's a tree ring scientist also, and he's been really instrumental in guiding us in putting this story together and putting it in a context. Well, here's a closer view of the JP99 sample. There's the stump again. There's the snag-like roots that are going off in that direction, and there's the hollow stem. And then here's where we believe the the big stump section we have in the stadium is from right about there. Okay, so this is the sample that we have, and Chris Gitterman, he took this sample and he resectioned it and produced another full cross section that we could study new, and we've mounted it on plywood here. And so what you're looking at is the mounted new specimen from JP99 that we studied in great detail. And what Chris did was he measured the tree rings from right about here on the right side all the way out to here on the left side, and then we matched those tree ring patterns with our chronology from the Four Corners region to date it, just like Douglas did. And these are the dates. So the innermost ring date here is 731, and the outermost date is 981 AD. Okay, so that sequence right there fits in that time period exactly. There's no plus or minus. This fits perfectly in that time period. And by the way, this is not the outermost date. So this tree actually lived quite a bit longer. What you're looking at here is what we call the heartwood. This darker colored wood is the heartwood. There was also sapwood, lighter colored wood on the outside, right around here, that underneath the bark, that's completely decayed away. So there were more rings, maybe as many as 100 more rings on the outside. So what I'm talking about here is this is the heartwood, the darker colored wood on the inside of the tree, and this is the lighter colored wood, the sapwood on the outside. So the sapwood decays away and leaves the heartwood because it has a lot more resin in it. So our general estimate is that this tree started growing in the 730s, and then it probably lived to the late 1000s, maybe early 1100s AD. So 700s to 1100. That's pretty remarkable because that's actually pretty much the full time span of the growth and development and occupation of Pueblo Bonito. So just now I'm going to tell you a bit about dendrochronology and tree rings and how they work and how we date it, how we do the cross dating and the tree ring dating. So first thing is notice the tree ring is made up of two parts, the lighter colored wood and then this dark band. So this lighter colored wood is formed in the spring, and then this dark band is formed in the summer, late summer, and that's 1 year. So 1 year's growth is a light band and a dark band. And then notice there's big fat rings and there's little skinny rings. And that's really critical for the cross dating because we find out that the fat rings are related to the wet years when there's more moisture and the trees can grow better. And then the small rings are related to the drought years. Well, Douglas figured this out, this whole thing about tree rings being a very useful guide for the past climate of an area, that you could reconstruct a drought history and a wet history by looking at the tree rings when he first started doing tree rings. And he came to tree rings by a very odd circuitous route. He was an astronomer. So Douglas was trained as an astronomer, and he came to the Southwest at the behest of Percival Lowell, who was a very wealthy astronomer from Massachusetts who basically self-funded his own research, and Lowell paid for the building of this observatory in Flagstaff, which is still there today. You can actually go visit the Mars Hill Observatory right above Flagstaff. Well, Douglas himself, as a younger man, built that observatory for Percival Lowell, and he was there for a number of years working with Lowell. And make a long story short, Percival Lowell believed he was studying Mars, and he saw these lines or canals on Mars, and he came to believe that canals were constructed by a civilization of Martians. And so he wrote about that Mars may have been inhabited by some lost civilization. And this is pretty fanciful ideas even back then, of course. And Douglas did not agree with that. He actually disagreed with it and said it wasn't true. And so Lowell fired Douglas. So Douglas lost his job with Lowell, and he then went to find another job, and he did. He became a professor at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And the reason that Douglas was interested in tree rings was that Douglas was interested in the sun and solar variability. So going all the way back to Galileo, people have been looking at the sun and seeing sunspots. And when they counted the number of sunspots on the surface of the sun over time, you see this amazing cycle. It's an 11-year cycle with maximum numbers of sunspots and minimum numbers of sunspots. And so there's clearly an 11-year cycle. And people had thought then and do now that the sun affects climate. So Douglas, working on this around 1910, 1920, he was trying to find a climate record from the Southwest that he could compare with a sunspot record. So he was looking for long climate history. And that's why he turned to tree rings, because he realized the tree rings could give him a climate history. And along the way, he, learned that he could cross state. He could match patterns of wide and narrow rings. This is actually an old movie, silent film from the National Geographic Society. I don't know if it's going to work very well, but it shows Douglas taking a core sample from a tree, and it shows him making a little plots. He's plotting out the ring patterns here now on a core sample from a tree, and here he's looking at a specimen. Douglas was famous by 1930. He was very famous for developing this method because he successfully used it to date the ruins of the Southwest, the great Pueblo ruins of the Southwest. The archaeologists sent him timbers from Mesa Verde and from Chaco Canyon and Pueblo Bonito, and he was able to tell them when those trees lived and when they died. And he did that by cross dating. Okay, so this is the basic idea of cross dating: is if you develop a chronology of wide and narrow rings from samples from living trees, you see the narrow fat rings and thin rings. So you have a chronology that's developed from living trees, and you know what the date is on the outside, and you count back, you can get the earlier dates. Then you can get a sample from a dead tree, and ultimately you can go farther and farther back in time and start to match timbers from ancient dwellings. So you see the matches here. These are the small ring patterns matching. So this is a bit like matching fingerprints or DNA sequences. It's matching of ringlet patterns. So Douglas successfully developed a multi-thousand-year-long tree ring chronology from trees, and he eventually, it took quite a year, it took 20 years actually, to build a long enough chronology to go back far enough in time to cross-date the timbers from Pueblo Bonito. But he finally was able to do that and give exact dates to dozens and dozens of tree ring sites all over the Southwest in 1929, and he reported those results in National Geographic in 1929 with this amazing title, Secrets of the Southwest Solved by Talkative Tree Rings. And he tells a story there. It's a fully illustrated article of the whole procedure of dating all these trees and determining the dates, including those from Pueblo Bonito. Okay, back to our story of the plaza tree. So we have some hypotheses, and we're curious about what is it. Now, where did that tree come from? Did it grow where it was found, like Neil Judd initially said? Or was it moved there? And did it grow somewhere in and around Chaco Canyon, and they moved it as a dead tree there? And if it wasn't from Chaco Canyon, where did it come from? Okay, so there's three different hypotheses here: hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, and hypothesis 3. Well, hypothesis 1, that the tree lived there, was actually pretty much blown away a few years ago by Chip Wills. He's an archaeologist at the University of New Mexico. And he went back and looked at this tree and its position of where they excavated it in Pueblo Bonito. And he pointed out that where they excavated the tree was right about here. It's in the plaza stratigraphy. It was the last, what they called the last used pavement of the West Plaza, just below the surface, maybe a couple feet deep, is where they found this stump and the 20-foot long log. All right. Well, the problem is, we know from the tree ring dating that this tree started growing in the 700s AD. And this surface right here at the plaza is the surface that was formed around 1000 AD. So 250, 300 years later, and it was built up. There was a lot of rubble and debris. You have to go down more than 3 meters, 8, 9, 10 feet to where you get down to the 700 level. So down at this depth, you find old structures from the early Pueblo Bonito. Okay, so this thing was not rooted at this point right here. There's no way that the roots could be up this high if the tree had started growing in 700. So Chip Wills pretty much showed that this tree could not have been growing there. And then we went back to the archives at the Tree Ring Lab in Tucson and looked and found lots of old documentary records and letters from from Neil Judd to Andrew Douglas, and he had a very different interpretation at the very beginning. So here's one of the first letters when Neil Judd wrote to Douglas and was talking to him about the stump. He said it lay close to the surface and it led me first to believe the tree had grown there, but failure to find any trace of decayed roots forced me to abandon this possibility. So his initial interpretation was that it probably didn't grow there because he found these short cut off stump-like roots, these snag-like, but didn't find little fine roots that you'd expect for a tree that had actually grown there. And so it turns out that, let's see if I can get this to continue here. There was another letter, go back. Yeah. One more letter, if I can get to it. The second letter in 1927, 3 years later, here he says, again, about the same sample, much decayed, 20-foot long log, West Court. Portions of the roots were still attached, but it seems unlikely to me this log could have been carried any great distance. However, I saw no evidence that the pine had grown where we found it. Its rings, if readable, should be among the latest record from Bonito. So early on, Judd did not think that the tree had grown there. But by 1954, when he published his monograph, he said he thought it had lived there. So they developed this idea that there used to be a forest around Pueblo Bonito, and they deforested it to provide all the timbers. And so they kind of forced the narrative of this tree to be having lived in Chaco Canyon and part of the remnant of the ancient forest that was used to construct Pueblo Bonito. But that is not the case. We know now from Chip Will's work, and we also know from other studies now that it wasn't, that couldn't have been a ponderosa pine forest there. We know that partly from the work of my good friend Julio Betancourt, shown here, and he's holding what's called amber rat. And what this is are the turds and urine of rats that pile up in caves in cliffs like those right around Pueblo Bonito. And so, if you have a car here in the Jemez Mountains, you've probably had pack rats under the hood. Well, if you left that car there for 100 years or 500 years, you'd have a pack rat midden inside of your engine compartment. And in there, the pack rats have brought in all sorts of plant parts, all the little sticks and cones and twigs and seeds and everything from vegetation within about 200 yards around the midden. They're bringing it in, and then they're pissing on it and pooping on it, and then it becomes hardened, and that stuff will last for tens of thousands of years. So these pack rat middens have been amazingly useful for reconstructing the history of vegetation. And here's the history of the vegetation around Chaco Canyon. And I know this graph is a little hard to see and figure out, but what you have is here on the vertical is time, and up here at the top is the present, and down here at the bottom is 6,000 years ago. So the present and 6,000 years ago. And then each one of these little graphs here is the abundance of the different plants that are shown up here, labeled up here. So for example, this little chart right here is pinon pine, the abundance of pinon pine. The longer the line here from left to right, the greater the abundance of pinon pine. And then over here is juniper. So notice this is that during the Chaco period, when they were living there, the pinon pine almost disappeared. And the juniper almost disappeared. So Julio Betancourt and his colleagues interpret this as being a basically denuded the woodland. There was a pinon juniper woodland there, and they denuded it for firewood, probably. Okay. And then the other key thing is, look, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, Rocky Mountain juniper, and spruce, none, all the way back to 5,000 years ago. You have to go back 5,000 years ago when it was a lot wetter before you'll find any ponderosa pine. So there's never been abundant ponderosa pine growing around, as far as we know, in Chaco Canyon. So that pretty much takes care of hypothesis one. Well, where the heck did it grow? Well, here's where we come into some more tree ring work to try to figure it out, some detective work to figure out the location of where that tree grew and where it came from. And so we've used a couple of different methods. We have hundreds of samples from Chaco Canyon and from Chetro These are cut off timbers from the trees they're used in the great houses. And this story has been developing over quite a few years. Jeff Dean and Julio Betancourt published in the 1980s. They pointed out that the latillas, when you go into the rooms and you find the big primary timbers, they tend to be ponderosa pine, but the latillas tend to be spruce. So the small secondary stems, the little 2-inch diameter, 3-inch diameter stems, you see those guys right there? Those are spruce. Where the heck did they come from? There's no way there was any spruce growing around Chaco Canyon anywhere in the last probably 15,000 years, okay? So those spruce had to come from high elevation areas like Mount Taylor and maybe the Jemez Mountains, as they were going very far afield to find these spruce trees. And then a really cool method that Julio and his colleagues developed is the use of strontium isotopes. So there's this isotope. It's it's an element, and it occurs in a couple of different isotopes: 87, strontium 87, and strontium 86. So this strontium is in soils, all kinds of soils, volcanic soils, sedimentary soils, and whatnot. And if you measure the ratio of strontium 87 to 86 in any given soil from any given mountain range, it'll match the strontium isotopes that you find in the trees that came from those soils. So the trees are taking up the strontium in the same amounts from the soils they grow in. So what they're doing now, able to do is take this, measure strontium isotope ratios in the different mountain ranges around the Four Corners region, and then see if they can match those with the tree ring samples from Pueblo Bonito. And that's what they've done. And kind of to jump ahead a little here, what they find is that the strontium was telling them that these samples probably came from the Chusca Mountains, mainly the Chusca Mountains. Okay. Now, the other way is by tree ring methods. And this is a paper where I was involved with Chris in 2016, where we actually showed also that the tree ring width patterns also show that the trees in Pueblo Bonito probably came mostly from the Chusca Mountains. So here's the map of the region. There's Pueblo Bonito in the center. There's all these different mountain ranges where the timbers could have come from. There's the Chusca Mountains. Here's the Jemez Mountains over here. Here's the San Mateo and Mount Taylor down over here, the Zuni Mountains, and way up here north of the San Juan River, the San Juan Mountains and La Plata. Okay, so each one of these mountain ranges, Julio and his colleagues have collected strontium isotopes, and then Chris and his colleagues, we've developed tree ring chronologies, tree ring width measurements from trees at each of these mountain range. And now we're taking samples from Pueblo Bonito and trees growing around Chaco, the very few ponderosa pines growing around Chaco Canyon, and testing the trees from Chaco against the trees in these different mountain ranges. So I just wanted to make a quick comment about the tree ring width chronologies. From each of these mountain ranges, now we have 1,200 to 1,500 year long tree ring chronologies. We had to develop really long chronologies that go back far enough in time to overlap with the ancient samples from Chaco Canyon. And that was a huge amount of work, developing these long measured tree ring chronologies from dozens of sampled old living and dead trees in these different mountain ranges to develop the long chronologies. Well, coming to the results was when we took the tree ring width chronology from these different mountain ranges, and we took more than 100 samples from Pueblo Bonito and Chetro Kettle, and we cross-dated them with the different mountain ranges. These are the mountain ranges where the samples cross-dated best. Okay, so out of about 100 samples, 70% of them, 70% of the samples we cross-dated of the 100 or so timbers we checked from Pueblo Bonito match up with the Chusca Mountains and the Zuni Mountains. There are some matching over here, and some of these are probably spruce samples. They're coming from high elevations where they went all the way to the tops of the mountains to find their spruces. And so here's what the time series looks like of where the trees came from in the great houses that we have samples and we've tested. So you can see initially the samples were coming mainly from the Zuni Mountains. We had samples originally, the old samples, the old part of Pueblo Bonito were coming mostly from the Zunis. And then starting in the 1000s AD, a lot more samples came from the Chuscas. And then notice here are these the red color, that's probably from Mount Taylor, and those are probably the spruce. The yellows here, these are samples that came from the Jemez Mountains, probably came from the Jemez Mountains. And they're probably also spruce, some of the spruce latias that we've tested. Now, here's the results from comparing the Lonesome pine, JPB 99. So this is the one tree ring sample from the West Plaza. We took it and we compared it to the tree ring chronologies in the different ranges all around that basin, the Chaco Basin. And most of the dating is leaning to the west, basic and the highest correlation. So these values you're seeing here are so-called T values. T values are telling you how strong the correlation is. So the higher the value, the stronger the correlation. So JPB cross states far better with any other trees than with the Chusca Mountains than from any other mountain range. All right. Best match is the Chuscas. And here's what that match actually looks like. Here's the tree ring chronology match of the Chuscas versus the Chusca Mountain tree ring chronologies in blue, and the Lonesome Pine JPB 99 is in red. And notice how closely they match. You can barely see the blue or the reds at times because it's right on top of the blue. So for hundreds of years, it's really marching really, really well together. Occasionally, there's some years when the JPB diverges from the mean chronology from the Chuscas, but overall, that's an extremely good match. And the probability of getting this kind of a match is like astronomically low if it was just by chance. All right. So this is a very, very strong match of JPB with the Chusca Mountains. Also, incidentally, we did have a few samples of ponderosa pine from Chaco Canyon. So remember at the very beginning, I showed you a few scraggly ponderosa pines growing near Chaco. Well, when we tested those trees, those few trees that we had, about 12 of the Chaco ponderosa pine, those trees correlate better with the chronologies to the east, right? So basically, these if the trees at Pueblo Bonito had come from a local area, they would show this kind of a pattern. Instead, the trees from Pueblo Bonito show a much stronger correlation with the Chuscas, whereas the trees that did grow in Chaco Canyon, they show a correlation to the east. Finally, the strontium isotopes. So we took strontium isotopes from JPB. Here's a strontium isotopes ratio of the JPB, and then here's the strontium isotope ratios from the different mountain ranges around the Chaco Basin. And you'll notice that the Chaco pines, the strontium ratios from the Chaco pines are over here, whereas the strontium ratio from JPB, from the Lonesome Pine, does not match the Chaco pines, and it matches the probability of the strontium ratios, and the Chusca Mountains is much better. So what you're looking at here are these shaded areas. These are the probability levels of the strontium ratios given the variability in the measuring technique. And there is a little bit of overlap with JPB of the La Plata Mountains, but over on this far left side, it's much more likely that the strontium ratios is matching the Chusca Mountains best, right? The best matches with the Chusca Mountains. So the strontium ratios and the ring width patterns are telling us that most of the timbers from Chaco Canyon and the great houses come from the Zuni Mountains early and then the Chaco Mountains later, and the Lonesome Pine itself probably came from the Chusca Mountains. And that fits what we know about other history. It turns out that there's all sorts of imported materials, chip stone, which comes from the Chuscas. We know this kind of stone is only from the Chuscas, and pottery types from Pueblo villages that were over around the Chuscas. Those pottery types show up at Chaco Canyon at the same time period that the timbers do. So there's other evidence that that period is when a lot of stuff was coming from the Chusca Mountains. So we basically have found that, you know, the tree did not grow in the plaza, unfortunately, in some way, because that's kind of a cool story. It didn't grow right near Chaco. They didn't carry it just a short distance, but it originated from a distant mountain range, and in fact, the Chusca Mountains. And that is an amazing story in itself. Think about the fact that that tree, I didn't know if I mentioned this, but this tree is probably, we estimated it was at least 24 inches in diameter. And they found a 20-foot log laying on the last surface of Pueblo Bonito. So this is a massive thing. And it probably had bits of roots left on it, okay? So how in the world did they carry all that wood to Chaco Canyon? And people have speculated about this for a long time now. How in the world did they haul all of the wood there? And this is a National Geographic rendition version of it with a smaller normal timber, 8 to 10 inches. And then here, this would be a big timber, a 24 plus inch diameter. And by the way, the Lonesome Pine was not the only 20 plus inch diameter tree. With the great kivas, that exists there in Pueblo Bonito and at Casa Rinconada, the great kiva that's there. This is massive kivas, 60 feet across or more. Those things had 24, even larger diameter trees holding up the roof. So they hauled many 24 plus inch diameter trees, 50, 60 miles in some cases, long distance. Though they were using these roads, these peculiar linear roads, which now show up. You can see them from aerial surveys and from LiDAR. You can pick out these long linear roads, and they were carrying or maybe rolling their timbers. This is one idea of how maybe they were moving timbers along these roadways, rolling them on rolling trackways, where they set out a couple rails and then they'd roll the logs along them. I don't know. It's all speculative about how they did this, but the fact is, hundreds of thousands of timbers were hauled tens and tens of miles across the high desert to Pueblo Bonito, which is just an amazing story. And so, what the heck was it? If it wasn't a living tree in the plaza, what was it? Well, some people suggested maybe it was a gnomon, and a gnomon is something that casts a shadow, like a sundial. And so the thought is that maybe, as a living tree, or it was not a living tree, as a pole in the plaza, the West Plaza. Maybe it was used to cast shadows. And at different times of years, those shadows would have projected over the tops of the kivas and different parts of Pueblo Bonito itself. And so it may have been used as a time marker itself for Pueblo Bonito. Another possibility is that maybe the pole was a climbing pole, a ceremonial climbing pole. It's an intriguing thought because, in fact, this is a tradition that's still practiced today in some pueblos, particularly Picaris Pueblo and Taos Pueblo have pole climbing ceremonies. I believe it's on the San Geronimo feast day. They have a pole climbing ceremony, and they erect a very tall, big post buried in the ground. From which people climb up it. And there's pole climbing ceremonies, I believe, in some native groups down in Mexico. Maybe there's a much more mundane explanation. Maybe that big chunk of that log was intended to be firewood. There are big hearths, big fire pits in the plaza, and they did burn lots of wood in there. So maybe they were going to use it for firewood. Maybe it was a bench. Maybe it was they were using that big log as a bench. We don't really know. At this point, it's a speculation, but that's the way it is. In some ways, it's kind of unfortunate that we've overturned the idea that there was a living tree. There was a pole, a dead tree, but it was carried long distance, and that's an amazing mystery in itself. And the long-term explanation will probably remain shrouded in mystery. At this point, what we have is our scientific explanations, and they're just as they are, and they may be overturned. Excuse me. Last, I just wanted to say with humility that this is probably not the only story. There may be a Puebloan cultural narrative and a cultural story, legends of this tree. I have shared this story with my friends from Jemez Pueblo, and they're very intrigued and very interested in this whole story, but they haven't offered me a different explanation or a different narrative yet. And maybe it's just because they're not sharing that with me yet. And likewise, maybe the other pueblos, the Zuni or the Hopi or other pueblos in northern New Mexico have some tradition about the great lonesome pine of Chaco. And maybe we'll learn about that in the future, and maybe not. But for now, we have some scientific explanations that it was a very big tree brought into Pueblo Bonito 1,000 years ago or so. Well, last, I just want to say, if any of you are interested in reading about this story, I have reprints. I can actually send you a PDF files. This paper was published earlier this spring, and so I can send you a copy of this paper published in American Antiquity. You got the cover of that one. And then in 2016, there was our other paper. If I can get this to, in 2016, our other paper, I have a copy of this one also, which was in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And there were two commentaries written about the long distance transport story by Adam Watson and Jared Diamond. And I can send you copies of all these. If you want to send me an email, there's my email address, treering1748@gmail.com. So with that, I just will acknowledge all of the funding sources and all the people who contributed, especially Chris Gitterman, who did most of this work, and my other colleagues, and all. Thank you, and we'll take any questions if there are any. All right, Judy?
There was one.
Okay, got one question.
but I don't have it yet.
Okay, so the one question was from Paula Lozar. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name right, but could it have been a ceremonial tree? For example, at a lot of deer dances, they plant a little tree in the plaza and the deer dance around it.
Yeah, good question. Good point. Yeah, I think that's entirely plausible that it was a ceremonial tree. Um, as we discovered and as Chip Wills showed, it's not likely to have grown there though. So this particular tree, this particular one, JP99, in all likelihood, with very high degree of probability, that tree was brought in as a dead tree, 24-inch diameter dead tree hauled across the desert from the Chusca Mountains. Now that's not to say they may not have had some living trees planted in or around Pueblo Bonito itself and used them for ceremonial purposes, but this particular tree was a big log that they planted in the ground. You might remember that this thing had some kind of like snag, they call it snag like roots on it. And there are these long extended kind of like the base of the tree. They cut off all the small roots, but they left a few of the large roots intact. And that also makes sense for a pole that you're placed in the ground, because that would have stabilized the pole somewhat. Putting it in a big hole with those snag-like roots facing downward and then piling dirt and rocks around it would have stabilized that pole pretty well. Okay, are there any other questions? Okay.
There's a few other comments, but if you're able to unmute yourself and ask your question over the mic, please go ahead and do that. And if not, I'll read off the comments.
Tom, how long would it have taken to haul that tree from the Chusca Mountains to?
No, there's no.
Yeah.
no
How
no
long?
horses.
How long to haul it or roll it? Boy, that your guess is as good as mine. If you draw a straight line from Pueblo Bonito to like the closest location of the Chuscas, you're looking at least 40 miles. And if it were like to the center part of the Chuscas, more like 50 miles or so. And the roads are very peculiar. They're pretty darn straight. And they just kind of go uphill dale, up and hill dale, down and over. And so, it would have been a lot of labor. Surely it would have been many days to haul timbers all the way 40 miles, and a big crew, lots of people. And so they find actually along these roadways, they find lots and lots of pottery sherds, and lots of artifacts, because they're having to carry their food and their water with them back and forth on these roadways for hauling.
I was wondering if I could ask a question about the transportation of the logs. When I was in Newgrange in Ireland, they found that a lot of the wood that was the rocks, actually, they were huge, humongous rocks, that they did not come from the region where this was set up, but came from very far away. So is it true that that can be found in many other places where either trees or rocks or some other structure is being transported for some particular reason?
Yes, undoubtedly, there are probably many other southwestern Pueblo ruins where materials have been imported for the construction of those structures. The great houses, the Chacoan type great houses that you find in Chaco Canyon and up around Aztec are probably the greatest examples, but there are others in southern Colorado where you have this style of construction with really big kivas. And one of the features of the kivas, and you can see these, I think, at Chaco and also in Aztec, is at the base of the pillars that were holding up the roof of these massive wooden roofs of these kivas. They would bury underneath that pillar a stone disc. And so these stone discs are like 3-4 feet in diameter and weigh a ton or more. I mean, these really heavy stone discs that have been milled and then transported long distance and brought in to be the base underneath the upright pillars within the kivas. So just another example of long distance transport of really heavy materials. These people were really organized and had, you know, organized work crews that knew what they were doing, and they knew how to move heavy stuff, and they knew how to build long lasting, really resilient structures to still have standing walls 1,000 years later.
So is there some research about that, about transportation of, you know, whether it's trees or rocks at various structures around the world?
Oh yes, yeah. One of the famous ones, of course, is people have speculated about Easter Island and how the
Mm,
great heads have been moved. And so, yeah, this is a favorite topic of discussion and speculation about how they moved all sorts of heavy stones across the landscape. And so there's a lot of material on that. And I think if you did a little bit of searching, I'm not an expert on this. There
mhm.
are papers out there on the movement of the wood and some of the stone.
How'd they chop them down with no
Great.
metal?
So I see there's a question someone asked, any idea why Judd changed his interpretation over time? Yeah, that's an interesting one. And it's where, you know, scientific understanding, it changes. And his initial impression was that, you know, this thing probably didn't grow here. He could see these snag-like cutoff roots, but he didn't find enough roots to really believe that it had grown there. And then later on, he somehow convinced himself that it had grown there, and it was the last remnant of a forest. And so I don't really know why, but I speculate that Judd and other archaeologists finding this tree and then still wondering where the heck did all these trees come from, the simplest explanation to them was that there must have been a forest around here. There must have been a forest nearby. That seemed to be a simpler explanation than then they hauled 200,000 timbers 40 miles across the desert. So I think the archaeologists really were trying to find a narrative that fit a simpler explanation, that there used to be a forest around Pueblo Bonito, but now we know there really wasn't. There was never enough trees around Pueblo Bonito during its construction to provide all those timbers, and they came from Chuscas. And someone said, well, with no metal, how were the trees felled? Stone axe cuts. So they had stone tools, stone axes, and you have to cut a living tree. It was dead. You can't really cut a dead tree down. The green trees you can cut down. It's a lot of work. You can cut down a green tree, and also fire. So they would chop around a tree and also then build a fire around the base of the tree, sometimes to burn it down. But there was a lot of cutting with stone axes, and we find actually on many of the timbers in Chaco Canyon, the vigas, the ends of them, you can see where they've been cut by a stone axe, as it leaves a very distinctive kind of an end of a viga versus a steel axe. You can see a very big difference between a steel axe cut beam end and a stone axe cut beam end. So we have many examples of stone worked wood from Pueblo Bonito and the other great houses.
So Tom, I'm curious about on the roads from like the Chusca to Pueblo Bonito, like there's a lot of shard and other stuff there. Are you able to identify who the people were that did this work? Because my understanding that Chaco was not a population center per se.
Yeah, good question. You know, I should admit right here, I should have admitted at the very beginning that I am not an archaeologist myself. I'm a tree ring scientist and a forest ecologist primarily. And so the archaeology is rubbed off on me a little bit, but I don't know enough to answer that question about what kind of the pottery, you know, that's found along the roadways, whether it tells where the people were from. One thing I would say is that one of the things we cited in our paper was that they do find Chusca type pottery that are from pueblos and the cultures that were much more characteristic of the Zunic landscape. They find that pottery being imported into the Pueblo Bonito. So there's a rise of the Chusca style pottery in Pueblo Bonito in the 1000s or so, right at the time when most of the timbers are arriving. So it's a good question, though. I suspect somebody has probably studied or will study the pottery types along the roadways and see what that says about, where do these people come from? If there's any clues in the types of pottery that tells us who were the people that were using these roadways.
Pete Taylor's on. Could he answer
Thanks.
that? Good question.
Yeah. So yeah, Tom Wines. Yeah, Tom Wines. Connie, I see Connie's on, who's really very knowledgeable about this matter. Connie Constant. Hi, Connie. And she says that Tom Wines has done work on the roadways, and probably if you did a Google search on Tom Wines, WINDES, and Chaco roadways, you may find some of his work on the ceramics that are found along the roadways. I don't know.
Very good. Thank you, Connie.
Okay, any evidence on the vigas themselves, on how they were moved, or were they polished before they were installed? Good question. There's one of the curious things that I've heard repeated again by my tree ring colleagues like Jeff Dean and others. One of the curious things is that the beams, the vigas that we have, show no sign of dragging. No sign of having been beaten up and beaten around like they're just all beat up because they've been drug across the landscape. No, they're almost always really smooth and pristine looking and really pretty. I mean, you might remember those pictures I showed of some of the ceilings. You don't see scratch marks. You don't see deep gouge or scratch marks generally. So it doesn't, that's one of the curious things. Which probably leads maybe to a more of an interpretation that these things were carried rather than rolled or dragged. Or maybe they left the bark on them and that protected them somewhat until they got them to Pueblo Bonito. But I expect they probably peeled them beforehand and dried them out. I mean, you wouldn't want to be carrying a green wet log weighs multiple times more than a dry log. So they probably dried them out beforehand, I would think, before they'd haul them all that distance. Okay. Looks like that might be most or all of the questions.
I noticed Robert has been unmuted. Robert, did you have a question?
Well, I've been thinking about it. This is probably a subject for a whole nother discussion, but I've always wondered with places like Stonehenge and Chaco and Easter Island, why they decided to build so far from their source of materials.
Yeah, good question.
Yeah. Chaco is such a mysterious place. This is one of the reasons, besides the fabulous, diversity of the architecture and the artifacts, the materials found there. It was obviously a unique culture with a lot of development and specialization of skills and crafts. And people speculated for a long time on why the heck would this have developed in the desert there. And there's a number of great explanations out there. There are, at this point, people's ideas, people's best theories and understanding. I guess mine, which is just one interpretation, is that it was probably more ceremonial. It was more of a ceremonial place than a permanently settled place with a large population, maybe a smaller population of hereditary folks who were ruling or had a hierarchical classification in the system, but a smaller number of people. And then during seasonal periods, it increased to larger numbers of people coming in. But why would you build that out in the middle of the desert, so far away from materials? And probably, I mean, it may have been relatively easy to grow corn there and beans there and squash there at one time, but not particularly right now. So it's not a really a great place to farm either. Currently, maybe in the past it was. It's mystery. It's one of the mysteries that keeps us wondering about this fabulous place. Okay, I'm gonna give it to Suzanne for a farewell and a final thank you here to everybody.
Yes, I do want to thank everyone, and I do want to thank Tom for this presentation. He spent a lot of time on it, getting it set up, and I'm very proud that he would do it for us. And I wanted to thank Janet for setting up the Zoom for us, and to Dee Plana, who did all of the gathering of your names and your emails and sending out all the communications. Thank you, Dee. And to all the board for all that they are doing. And to you all, our supporters, we truly, truly appreciate you and what you are doing. Thank you very, very much. And everyone have a great rest of the week.
And thank you.
Thank you.
And know that this was recorded, so we will be sending that link out after the meeting.
Oh,
Okay.
fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.